Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of the Greenglade Gap. In the 154th year of the Common Reckoning, Eldaron Broadleaf led an army of elves through the wood wall, breaking 60 years of peace, bringing sword and fire into the halfling lands. Columns of halfling refugees fled toward Greenglade, with the elves in pursuit. The halflings were footsore and heavily laden, burdened by whatever of their worldly goods they had hastily gathered, and further slowed by the many children and elderly among them. The elves travelled light and marched quickly, eager to complete their work and cleanse all traces of halflings from the land. It was becoming increasingly clear to those halflings who pondered on such matters that, unless some action were taken, the elves would inevitably chase the halflings down and wreak bloody havoc upon them. The halflings lacked any formal organisation, but, sitting around their campfires in the evening, small groups of halfling menfolk discussed what could be done, and independently determined to turn and make a stand, with the intention of halting or at least delaying the elven advance, and thus buying time for the halfling women and children to escape to safety. The result was that many groups of halflings armed themselves and moved to the rear of the halfling columns. These groups of halflings then coalesced, forming a sizable rearguard, some 800 halflings strong, and, as the halfling host streamed through the Greenglade Gap, this rearguard turned to fight. The battlefield the halflings had selected consisted of flat and fertile farmland, dotted with small stands of trees. On the right of the halfling line, 200 halflings, armed with bows and slings, lined the walls of Applecheek Farm. In the fields behind them were arrayed 200 halflings, bearing spear and shield. In the centre, 200 halflings armed with bows and slings took cover on the fringes of pinecone wood. Finally, 200 spear halflings were positioned in the fields of Cornflower Farm on the halfling left. Eldaron's army consisted of 600 mail-clad elves. These were divided into 3 companies. Eldaron positioned himself in the centre with his guard, 200 elves bearing shield and sword. On each flank was a company of 200 archers, armed with the fearsome elven longbow. Eldaron ordered the archers on his right to move forward. The elves advanced until they were within longbow range of pinecone wood and formed a line, preparing to loose a cloud of arrows at the halflings under the trees. Now, halfling bows and slings are all very well, but they do not have the range of elven longbows. The halflings in the wood were therefore faced with a problem. They could stay where they were, in the cover of the trees, and passively endure an elven arrow storm. They could advance into the open, rendering themselves more vulnerable to elven archery, but closing the range to a distance where they could shoot back at the elves. Or they could withdraw deeper into the safety of the trees. They bravely chose to advance into the open. This was unwise. As Eldaron brought up his guard in support, the elven archers nocked their arrows and let fly at the advancing halflings. The carnage was terrific. Great gaps opened in the halfling line. Again the elven bowstrings sang, and yet more halflings perished. Eldaron laughed. The halfling centre had been obliterated. The archers on the elven left had also advanced, and were now within longbow shot of Applecheek Farm. Seeing what had happened to their fellows in Pinecone Wood, the halflings lining the field walls prudently fell back, beyond the range of the elven archers. The spear halflings stationed at Cornflower Farm observed the collapse of the halflings' centre and the withdrawal of the halfling right, and started to feel rather isolated and nervous. They decided that there was safety in numbers, and, abandoning their position on the halfling left, set off across the battlefield to join and shore up the halflings' wavering right flank. The elven archers continued to push forward, advancing on Applecheek Farm. Unsure of the intentions of the relocating spear halflings, who were now concealed behind Pinecone Wood, Eldaron and his guard moved further to their right to protect the elven flank should the halflings attempt anything rash. The halflings did attack, but that attack did not fall upon the elven right. It came from Applecheek Farm. The advance of the elven archers had now brought them within halfling bowshot of the field walls. The halflings who had retreated back into the fields now advanced back to those walls, loosing arrows and hurling slingstones at the advancing elves. This attack had some success. The elves suffered a number of casualties, but it provoked a deadly response. The elven longbows unleashed a hail of arrows hissing over the field wall into the halflings cowering behind it, wreaking red ruin upon them. As the forces continued to exchange missiles, Eldaron's guard amused themselves by mopping up the hapless remnants of the halfling centre, and regrouped for a final assault on Applecheek Farm, which had now been reinforced by the spear halflings arrived from Cornflower Farm. The elven archers were winning the upper hand. Most of the halfling archers and slingers lining the wall had been pierced by elven arrows. Spear halflings stepped up to fill the gaps in the ranks, ready to repel the impending elven charge. Up to the wall rushed the elven guard, Eldaron at their head. For a moment the spear halflings held back the elven tide, and then the bulk of the halflings broke and fled, and the elves poured over the wall, overwhelming the few halflings who still held their ground, slaying them where they stood. Thus ended the Battle of the Greenglade Gap.